Great. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. Good morning and good afternoon for everybody who's attending. Welcome to the unveiling of the 2023 KnowTheChain Apparel and Footwear benchmark findings, which we're launching with this special event entitled Taking Stock of Forced Labour in Global Apparel and Footwear Supply Chains. My name is Anya Clark and I'm head of KnowTheChain and investor strategy for the wider Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. And I'm joined today by my colleague, senior researcher Rosie Monaghan, and a panel of subject matter experts and allies to dig deeper into the findings today. So before I get started, I just wanted to run through some housekeeping and the agenda. So the session will run for about 90 minutes. The first part will be dedicated to a presentation of the findings, and I apologize in advance because this is a data-heavy section of the presentation, so do bear with us. We'll take you through the findings across four thematic areas, highlighting good practice across those four areas and making recommendations as well. The second part of the discussion will be a panel discussion between four expert panel members from the labour rights, the corporate accountability and the responsible investment world to dig deeper into the findings and also reflect on challenges and how we move forward with them. The last 15 minutes then will be dedicated to a question and answer session. So please do keep yourselves on mute for the session. And if you have a question, feel free to pop it in the Q&A box and we will get there at the end of the event. If you have any technical issues, which we hope you don't, because none of us are technical experts here, but if you do, please do let me know or let my colleague Rosie know, and we'll endeavour to resolve them as soon as possible. And so to our wonderful panel of speakers, let me first introduce Karen Stauss. Karen is the Director of Strategic Engagement at Transparentem, an organisation which strives to drive industry-wide change through in-depth investigations, strategic engagement with companies and policy advocacy. Karen leads engagement with the private sector to remedy labour and environmental abuses connected to global supply chains. And before joining Transparentem, Karen served as Senior Policy Counsel in the US Department of Justice's Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit. She also served as Director of Programs at Free the Slaves, where she oversaw all aspects of the organisation's community-based programs in 8 countries to eliminate forced labour. She served as Managing Attorney and Policy Counsel at Polaris Project and was a founding member of the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable and the Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking. Dheeraj is an advisor with Partners in Change and an Indian civil society organisation working to promote responsible business in India. His work focuses on issues of corporate transparency and accountability at the interface between workers and affected communities. He has been researching disclosures and policy commitments of the top companies in India since 2013. Currently, he analyses the non-financial disclosures of the top 1,000 listed companies in India, particularly in relation to the just transition. He is also part of the principal research team of India's Responsible Business Index and has led processes for conducting due diligence studies focusing on agricultural and garment supply chains. Liz Umlas is a senior advisor, capital strategies at IndustriALL Global Union, which represents 50 million workers in 140 countries in the mining, energy and manufacturing sectors, including the garment and textile, leather and shoe sectors. Her work with IndustriALL centres on investor engagement to improve corporate respect for workers' fundamental rights. She is currently working with IndustriALL to build investor support for moving the garment and footwear sector away from voluntary self-reporting schemes towards binding agreements between trade unions and multinational brands. Liz is also an independent researcher and consultant with over 20 years of experience in both sustainable investment and in the field of business and human rights, a topic that she teaches at several universities. And Lisa Hayles is the Director of International Advocacy at Trillium Asset Management, an impact-driven, ESG-focused asset manager dedicated to aligning values with investment objectives. She is responsible for engaging Trillium's international holdings and global policymakers on environmental, social, and governance topics. She has more than 20 years of experience advising institutional and individual investors on sustainable investing approaches in North America and in Europe. Lisa received her BA in Political Science and History from the University of Toronto and an MSc in International Development for the University of Guelph. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And you're going to go off camera now for a little while until we bring you back in for the panel discussion later in the session. So just before we dig into the meat of the findings, it's important to outline what KnowTheChain is and does for those who are less familiar with the program. So we are a program of the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, and in practice we are a research for companies and investors to better understand and address forced labour and labour rights risks and negative impacts in the supply chains. We use benchmarking as a way to build on competitive market dynamics and reputational risks to create a race to the top in corporate practice. And we've been benchmarking companies across 3 high-risk sectors, so the apparel and footwear sector, ICT and food and beverage sectors since 2016. And this is our 12th benchmark in total and 4th in the apparel and footwear sector since we began. Our methodology is broadly aligned with the UNGPs in assessing how companies are identifying, mitigating and remedying labour abuses within their supply chains. Our target company list is based on market capitalisation and the percentage of revenues derived from own branded products, with a geographical tilt to ensure regional diversification. So we're capturing the largest companies by market capitalisation per sector covered. Our methodology has evolved alongside legislative developments and human rights due diligence and increased stakeholder expectations, so that we're ensuring that we're measuring what matters. So to ground truth us in our in the topic that we're focused on today, I wanted to briefly outline the global contexts, which is both exacerbating but also seeking to mitigate forced labour risks in the apparel and footwear supply chain. And it comes to no surprise for any of us on the call that as one of the largest sectors in the world by revenue and market capitalization, it is heavily reliant on both natural and human resources. Conservatively, it employs roughly about 60 million workers in the textile, clothing, leather and footwear industries in Asia alone. And that means that there is enormous potential for human and environmental harms. The sector has long been characterized by precarious employment, poor working conditions, and a lack of collective bargaining agreements. Furthermore, there has been traditionally been a lack of automation in the sector, with processes like spinning, dyeing, sewing, and weaving highly labor intensive. And concerns around labour abuse are amplified by the fact that the majority of work is done by women, so on average 60% globally, and migrant workers who receive disproportionately lower wages, often insufficient to meet basic needs, and face other types of discrimination. If we look at the factors exacerbating forced labour risks in 2023 and 2024, we see growing inequality, the increased pace of production, the climate crisis, geopolitical tension and conflict, and a weakening of labour laws in key sourcing countries, which are all driving up the instances of labour abuse and exploitation. Focusing specifically on the intersection of climate and geopolitical crisis means increased displacement for many workers. Migrant workers are often overlooked in apparel supply chains, yet they are the backbone of the sector, whether in apparel manufacturing or at raw material level, including cotton picking. labour rights risks are heightened for this cohort of workers, ranging from, as I mentioned, discrimination to document withholding, extortionate fee charging, which leads to conditions of debt bondage and forced labour. The hyperinflation experienced globally in the past 2 years has also contributed to a cost of living crisis, exacerbating vulnerability as wages have remained stagnant or fallen. As workers become more desperate, they are more likely to have to accept and be forced into exploitative employment, including with heightened risk of forced labour. So let's look at the factors that are mitigating or seeking to mitigate forced labour globally. And what we see is a much more vigorous shift in what is expected from apparel companies in response to these increasingly dire conditions and as a result of emerging human rights due diligence legislation. So the past number of years, we've seen a clear shift in what the expectation and the standard should be. So the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act, due diligence laws in Canada, Australia, Norway have been placed on top of existing laws in France and Germany. I need not mention the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is about to be voted on by member states, fingers crossed. We know that purchasing practice in particular and meaningful stakeholder engagement will be required as part of that agreed text. An upcoming the EU import ban, which is seeking to put sanctions on goods produced with forced labour. So a key element of all of these pieces of legislation is the attention to supply chain visibility, excuse me, and transparency. So this idea of knowing and showing human rights risk across the supply chain. So that entails, having visibility into and down to raw material level and in terms of high risk sourcing countries and raw materials. These legislative developments set a new standard for what the market expects of consumer goods companies, including apparel and footwear companies. It's clear that those companies that are prepared benefit from these changes, as it will set a bar in terms of company practice in mitigating these risks, and that companies who are agile will adapt and fare much better. But some of the results that we'll go through today seem to suggest that companies are being largely reactive to these risks. And without further ado, I will hand over to Rosie Monaghan, who will take us through the findings in more detail. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Anya, and thank you so much, everyone, for taking time to join us today. So we're kicking off with the benchmark ranking of the 65 apparel and footwear companies assessed. And with so many companies assessed now, it is a bit difficult to make out all the company names on this slide, I appreciate. But this will give you a sense of how vast the range of scores in the sector is. And I have just shared some links in the chat, so you can find a link there to the benchmark ranking on our website if you want to take a closer look. So the average score for the sector is 21 out of 100. 3 companies scored above 50, and 20% of companies scored 5 or less. So the range of scores is quite drastic. And if we move to the next slide, for those who are not familiar, our benchmark methodology is comprised of 7 themes, which are broadly based on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, with theme 1 covering commitment, themes 2 to 6 covering various forms of due diligence, and theme 7 covering remedy. This graph shows the average score of the sector per benchmark theme. Companies scored highest on the theme of commitment and governance, which includes things like a supplier code of conduct addressing the ILO core labour standards, internal responsibility for that code, and training and capacity building. This is followed by traceability and risk assessment with an average score of 24, which assesses traceability and supply chain transparency at first tier, below first tier, and at raw material level across high-risk raw materials, as well as how companies conduct a human rights risk assessment on their supply chains. So as you can see, the sector performed poorest on the themes of remedy and purchasing practices, followed by recruitment, which assesses the policies and processes companies have in place for protecting migrant workers. We'll hear more about these in the next few slides once we dig deeper into the key findings. And just to give you a bit of framing for that, the key findings that we're going to outline today are based on 5 categories: supply chain transparency, worker-driven due diligence, purchasing practices, responsible recruitment, and remedy. And before we do go into the key findings, we wanted to highlight some of the trends that we're seeing in the sector, particularly when we look at how things have changed since our last benchmark in 2021. So a total of 37 companies were benchmarked by KnowTheChain in both 2021 and 2023. And just a quick note on this, the methodology has changed quite significantly between those 2 years, which has resulted in lower company scores across the board. However, a low score shouldn't necessarily be taken as an indication that a company has failed to improve entirely. And we have noted the areas where we've seen improvement throughout the benchmark report and also in companies' individual scorecards. What we have seen is a widening gap between higher and lower scoring companies in the benchmark, which can be seen as a gap between those companies who are demonstrating stronger implementation of their policies and processes and the outcomes that they result in, and those who may only disclose, for example, a supplier code of conduct and a process for monitoring suppliers against it. Positively, we found growing supply chain transparency in the sector, with 10 companies either publishing first-tier supplier lists for the first time or strengthening their existing disclosure. 3 companies disclosed a second or third-tier supplier list for the first time. We also saw a significant increase in the number of no-fee policies adopted by companies in the sector. 7 companies newly adopted a policy prohibiting recruitment fees in their supply chains, and 3 strengthened an existing policy. However, we didn't see the same increase in disclosure in relation to policy implementation, including due diligence processes for preventing fees from being charged to workers in the first instance. We noted particularly strong improvements from Asia-based companies who all demonstrated progress except for 1. Particularly noteworthy improvements were seen from ASICS, Fast Retailing, and Anta. And finally, purchasing practices remains low scoring overall in the sector, and this was an area where we didn't really see much progress from companies since 2021, and I'll go into this in a bit more detail shortly. So then beginning our overview of key findings with supply chain transparency. This is a crucial element of due diligence and one that is increasingly at the center of new legislation. As I mentioned, we did see improvements in this area, and now we see that just over half of all benchmark companies disclose a list of names and addresses of all or the majority of their first-tier suppliers. Then 31% of companies disclose a list of names and locations of suppliers in their second tier or further. We saw several companies provide lists down to the 4th tier. Finally, in order to capture the demand for visibility at raw material level, we also look at whether companies disclose sourcing countries for the raw materials they source that are considered high risk for forced labor. 20% of companies disclose partial information on where they source at least some of these raw materials from. The second area we wanted to speak to is worker-driven due diligence. Something that we see in the sector is that much of the effort to meet the demand for more ethical supply chains is taking place in an extremely top-down, compliance-oriented fashion, with little input from the people who actually have the best understanding of these risks, who are the workers themselves. So incorporating these elements of worker-driven or worker-centered due diligence is crucial for the obvious reason that since workers are the ones who are familiar with the conditions they are working in, they have relevant, locally specific and timely knowledge to inform companies' understanding of risks. So opening up space, firstly for workers or worker groups to contribute to things like identifying risks or the design of prevention mechanisms, to have information channels that workers trust so that you can receive information in real time, means not just that the due diligence process is more robust and more effective in guaranteeing safe working conditions, but also helps companies focus on prevention rather than managing risks when they've already turned into violations. In KnowTheChain, we look at several components of worker-driven due diligence. Firstly, freedom of association, which really is a building block for everything else, as it enables workers to come together to voice their concerns and bargain for better conditions. We also look at engagement with worker groups and civil society in identifying risks, in determining what measures are put in place in response to these risks, and in devising adequate remedy measures when human rights abuses are discovered, as well as worker input into the design and operation of grievance mechanisms, which we'll talk a bit more about later. As to our key findings on this, we see a concerning gap between the number of companies that report conducting certain due diligence steps and companies that actually report that they engage with relevant stakeholders in the process. To give a couple of examples, while over half of companies benchmarked now disclose a human rights risk or impact assessment and how they carry that out, only 5% even mention engaging with workers, unions, or civil society in identifying risks, raising questions about how accurate these assessments can be. And when it comes to freedom of association, while it's very commonplace for companies to have supplier codes that require compliance with at least some standards on freedom of association, only just under a third of companies disclose practical steps, such as working with unions on freedom of association in their supply chains, or becoming party to an enforceable labour rights agreement to actually work towards that commitment in practice. We're happy to see this number slowly growing, as we have had a few more companies this year signing onto either the International Accord or the Pakistan Accord or other binding agreements. So in terms of good practice, there are 3 companies in the benchmark, Gap, H&M and PVH, who are party to the Dindigul Agreement, which is a binding agreement focused on addressing gender-based violence specifically. This includes floor monitors who are appointed and trained by local unions to help co-workers report GBV and liaise with management. Local unions are also given access to train management and workers, and the agreement establishes a grievance mechanism and legally binding protections in relation to retaliation and the right to freedom of association. H&M is also part of a global framework agreement with IndustriALL and IF Metal, which establishes national monitoring committees that include union representatives across 6 countries who oversee the implementation of the agreement and can function as a way to raise and address grievances from workers. And in terms of risk assessment, Primark reported a process involving rights holder consultation, including surveying workers in India in collaboration with a local NGO, and also engagement with IndustriALL throughout the risk assessment process. And finally, on the next slide, we have 3 benchmark companies who, at the time of the benchmark research, had joined the Employment Injury Scheme pilot in Bangladesh to provide income protection and medical care for workers, which includes commitments to financial contributions from the participating brands. And moving on to the third key finding we wanted to talk through. So on purchasing practices, we assess companies on 3 elements. Firstly, the steps taken to implement responsible purchasing practices, particularly in relation to planning and forecasting, pricing that doesn't undermine the supplier's ability to pay decent wages, and ring fencing of labour costs in pricing negotiations in particular. Secondly, whether the company has adopted so-called shared responsibility contracting in its contracts with suppliers, where the buyer commits to some of these responsible practices and providing remedy where its actions have contributed to violations. And thirdly, we ask companies to show how these practices are actually working by disclosing quantitative data points that would demonstrate this, such as their payment terms, the percentage of orders changed or cancelled after an order is placed, average or minimum lead times, for example. And despite the fact that it's now well documented that purchasing practices have a profound impact on working conditions, we found that progress on this theme is very slow, and it is the second lowest scoring theme in the benchmark. Much of this public disclosure is quite general and comes with few concrete steps and data points reported. We saw references to appropriate order volumes, avoiding excessive overtime hours, and ensuring sufficient lead times without companies defining what they mean by these terms. And so it's hard to get a sense of how responsible purchasing practices are. 42% of companies now disclose steps taken towards adopting responsible purchasing practices, and almost a quarter disclose at least 1 data point. These were most commonly payment terms, and only 6% of companies disclosed a data point other than payment terms. And notably, no company is disclosing year-on-year data on their purchasing practices, which would have allowed for measurement of improvement over time or lack thereof. In terms of some examples of company practice, ASICS disclosed some information on its planning and forecasting practices, including sharing forecasts 3 months ahead of production. Puma and H&M referred to costing tools used. In Puma's case, this was specified that premium and social insurance payments must be included in the labor costs within the price it pays to suppliers, and H&M mentioned that labor costs are itemized in its pricing. In terms of quantitative data showing how purchasing practices are working, Gap disclosed data on the percentage of orders cancelled for finished garments. This was less than 3%. And several companies disclosed their payment terms of either 15 or 30 days. On responsible recruitment, we have 2 key indicators within this theme. One which focuses on recruitment fees and related costs in particular, with one element assessing policy, one assessing preventative measures to ensure that workers don't pay fees in the first instance, and one ensuring remediation of fees to supply chain workers where they have paid fees. The second indicator focuses on broader efforts to support responsible recruitment in global supply chains, including tracing of labour agencies used by suppliers and working with relevant stakeholders on responsible recruitment. This could include training suppliers and recruitment agencies on ethical recruitment, supporting the development of ethical recruitment schemes, or engaging with policymakers to improve ethical recruitment standards, for example. So looking at recruitment fees, as I mentioned before, we did see an increase in the number of policies disclosed on this topic. We found that 65% of companies disclosed a policy prohibiting fees in their supply chains, but only 43% met the stronger standard of fully incorporating the employer pays principle, where it is made explicit that employers and not workers are responsible for the payment of fees and workers must be repaid where they're charged. There's a further gap to be seen between companies disclosing a policy and those disclosing how this policy is implemented. Only 12% of companies clearly outlined due diligence steps taken to prevent the charging of fees to supply chain workers, and the types of steps that we're looking for here include mapping labour agencies used in supply chains, mapping migrant worker journeys and fee amounts charged in different migration corridors, specialised monitoring for fees paid by workers, and examples of how suppliers have implemented the employer pays principle by paying labour agencies directly. And similarly, on repayment of fees to supply chain workers, only 8% of companies disclosed repayment in their supply chains. And if we move to the next slide, we can go through some good practice examples. So I just mentioned the type of due diligence steps that we're looking out for in relation to the implementation of the employer pays principle. This was the most comprehensive example that we found in this year's benchmark and related to the company's no-fee program in Taiwan. We've listed the different due diligence tools or measures on this slide. So firstly, the company requires that the no-fee requirement is stipulated in contracts with labour agencies. It outlines the documents that are checked during on-site visits. It describes the process for understanding recruitment channels used by suppliers and the mapping of migrant corridors and labour agencies. It also reports engaging with the Taiwan Direct Hiring Office to understand hiring channels further. The company discloses how it understands recruitment costs. Sources used include Veritas, migration corridor fact sheets, and available industry information, such as through the IOM and through worker interviews. The company disclosed that as of 2022, all 33 of its Taiwanese supplier facilities complied with the program's no-fee requirements. And a distinguishing factor of this disclosure was that the company reported some concrete examples of how suppliers had changed processes to comply with these requirements. So one supplier has a system to hire migrant workers from Indonesia through a direct hiring channel without using overseas labour agents, which reduced 70% of recruitment costs. Another supplier is using Vietnam and Thailand facilities to provide local recruitment services and therefore reducing costs charged by overseas labour agents. And another is using direct hiring for overseas recruitment while partnering with a Taiwanese labour agent. And as for responsible recruitment initiatives disclosed by companies, ASOS disclosed working with a local NGO to develop pre-departure training for migrant workers, considering migration from Madagascar to Mauritius, as well as for workers from Bangladesh to Mauritius. And Fast Retailing reported working with the IOM to provide training on responsible recruitment for sending country recruitment agencies in Sri Lanka and Nepal. In terms of repayment of recruitment fees, among the 8% of companies disclosing this were Puma, PVH, and Lululemon. And the type of detail included was varied. So, for example, Puma demonstrated remediation across supply chain contexts, so across four countries, and the amount repaid as well as the number of workers. And our final key finding is on remedy, the lowest scoring theme of the benchmark. Within our methodology, grievance mechanisms are actually assessed under the worker voice theme, but are of course also relevant to how companies are approaching access to remedy. 60% of companies clearly outlined a grievance mechanism for suppliers' workers. This drops to 8% when we look at mechanisms which involve workers or their representatives in the design or performance of grievance mechanisms to ensure that workers trust and use the mechanism. And there is again this gap between the disclosure of a policy or process and practice. So 23% of companies disclose data demonstrating the use of grievance mechanisms by supply chain workers. KnowTheChain also assesses whether companies disclose remedy outcomes for supply chain workers. This could include, for example, repayments addressing shortfalls in wages or recruitment fee repayment, returning passports to workers. And this is one indicator where we assess how companies have responded to broader labour rights violations beyond forced labour only. 22% of companies disclosed remedy outcomes for workers, and just 9% disclosed detail on multiple remedy outcomes for supply chain workers. And this was, again, a theme where we didn't see much movement since 2021. Final examples of company practice. So for mechanisms which involve workers or their representatives in their design or performance, examples included the Dindigul Agreement, which I mentioned earlier, and which 3 companies are party to in the benchmark, which establishes a mechanism that is managed by an oversight committee which includes representatives from a local union. And Fast Retailing disclosed an example specific to responding to harassment in Bangladesh, which established committees to deal with grievances, and these committees included workers so that they are part of the operation of the mechanism. And that brings us to the end of the key findings. So Anya, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks so much, Rosie, and feel free to take a well-deserved breather and a glass of water. And thanks everybody for staying with us. I know that's always pretty data heavy, but you can see there's quite a lot to get through. So just to invite you once again to put any questions that you have in the Q&A box, and we will have time to answer them at the end of the session. And I would invite all the panelists now to turn their cameras on so that we can dig a little bit deeper into the findings and really touch on some of the key issues that have come up across the different themes. And to start us off, I'd like to just ask each panel member to pick out one thing in the findings that surprised them or they'd like to comment on owing to their experience in the sector. And Liz, I might hand over to you first to give your first reflections.
Sure. Thanks, Anya. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So going back to one of the slides on worker-driven due diligence that Rosie presented, a disjuncture pops right out. You find that 89% of companies mention freedom of association and collective bargaining in their supplier codes of conduct. And yet you also find that over 70% did not disclose any instance of actual engagement of trade unions to support freedom of association in their supply chain. And only 5% disclosed how workers, trade unions, or civil society organizations are involved in risk assessment. And this comes back to a theme that Rosie underscored. It shows a real disconnect between a company's words and its deeds. Because while I think most companies these days make sure that they include the term freedom of association in their supplier code, according to your findings, very few either have or are willing to disclose any actual involvement of workers or trade unions in the nuts and bolts of due diligence. And it's good to see that the KnowTheChain benchmark takes note of companies that have, for example, global framework agreements with trade unions, or that participate in binding agreements, such as you mentioned, the International Accord for Health and Safety in the Textile and Garment Industry. To achieve meaningful stakeholder engagement, as per the UN guiding principles, there is no substitute for actual engagement. And a global framework agreement or active involvement in a binding agreement with trade unions, these could be good proxies for supply chain due diligence, and yet those companies are still really the exception. IndustriALL works on several of these agreements and believes that they are a key way forward to addressing persistent and serious human rights violations in garment and footwear supply chains. In contrast, I would say, to the prevailing voluntary corporate self-regulation or social auditing that's been heavily discredited over the decades, but is still a multi-billion-dollar industry. I wanted to make 2 more points. One is that binding agreements actually build worker representation, or voice, if you will, into governance structures in a meaningful way, which, by the way, is not only more protective of labor rights, it's also more likely to reduce the risk to companies and their investors, because it speaks of a more robust process that is more likely to capture and address problems before they become disasters. And finally, in addition to encouraging brands to undertake this kind of stakeholder engagement, IndustriALL is working to bring investors into the picture. Investors are increasingly aware of the risks of poor corporate due diligence, and in our conversations with them, we've seen that they show significant interest in mechanisms that can reduce these risks by, for example, building integral involvement of workers and trade unions into the supply chain due diligence process. Thanks.
Thanks, Liz, and we'll pick up on a number of those reflections as we go through the discussion, particularly the social auditing, and I'm sure Lisa can speak to the investor side of things as well. Karen, anything that popped out at you in the first instance?
Yes, thank you, Anya. Really, that average score of 7 out of 100 on the theme of remedy jumped out. That's the theme you said that companies scored lowest on, and that is very disheartening. Transparentem's investigations over the last decade have resulted in repayment or commitments to repay around $4 million to migrant workers for worker-paid recruitment fees and related costs. But while that amount is heartening from one perspective, it also means that in many cases, companies are still reactive. And we would quite like to be put out of business, actually, in that type of work. I think your results show that companies may have the right policy commitments in place to prohibit worker-paid fees and to repay workers. And responsible companies are willing to support repayment of workers when there's sufficient evidence in their view that workers have paid those fees. But in many cases, the company's due diligence systems are not strong enough to ensure that that evidence comes to light. And I think a recent example from Transparentem's work in Mauritius offers a case in point. Our investigation uncovered evidence of workers paying significant recruitment fees at 4 apparel manufacturers. And after we had engaged for more than 1 year with 18 companies about our findings, only 3 of those 18 companies had committed to repaying $420,000 to repay those workers. So the action of those 3 companies is commendable, but 15 other companies that we engaged failed to commit or implement any repayment of workers. So, and to the point that was just made, several of those companies pointed to audits that failed to uncover significant worker-paid recruitment fees in deciding not to repay the workers. And so we can talk more, I think, about the limits of social audits. But in any case, for all of those companies, the systems in place appeared insufficient to prevent foreign recruiters from charging employers while also double dipping by charging the workers. And so in terms of recommendations in this area, taking recruitment functions in-house might be necessary in the absence of sufficient government oversight and accountability for overseas recruitment. Otherwise, disempowered workers themselves, ironically, are under pressure to show that their employers are complying with the buyer's no-fee policies. Mauritian employers, in the example I was just speaking about, ask their workers to sign documents attesting that they have not paid recruitment fees. And in one especially bad case, workers were told that if they had paid recruitment fees, they could face termination. So it's an incentive to hide their own exploitation. There is so much room for improvement in the provision of remedy to workers who quite literally, but very unfairly, have paid the costs of keeping businesses running for all of our benefit.
Yeah, thanks so much, Karen. Lots to pick up on there, particularly around social auditing and the broken remediation system. But first, I'll hand over to Dheeraj to give his initial reflections on the findings.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I think first of all, I would like to congratulate the chain team for such a fabulous work in terms of putting data across, and this gives the reflection on what is actually happening in the apparel and garment sector. On findings, yeah, remedy with 8 average score is or lowest average score of 12 is quite a surprise, and because with UNGP's lot of mainstreaming happened on the theme of remedy, but still we are seeing it is scoring lowest on the scale. And on the question of purchasing practices, particularly because a lot of conversations are happening around what compliances need to be in place, but who is going to bear the cost at last? And that's where we are finding a lot of resonance when we are talking to MSMEs, particularly small actors in the supply chain, and they are talking about their challenges where sudden changes in the contract conditions or sudden termination of contracts put them into a very difficult situation, and a lot of loans or credit they are accessing from different channels, and sudden pressures put them under a lot of distressful situations. So that's I would say purchasing practices is the crux in terms of ensuring some of the other aspects also. But again, what we see what is happening is even in we look at these scores, like only 43% disclosing in terms of what steps they are taking. So a lot of we see high scoring when it comes to commitments, but when it comes to actually how to do it, that's where we find that a lot of things are not happening. Particularly if I quote some of the data, like 5% talking on how to engage workers. So again, this is something a matter of concern. Like we are talking about stakeholder engagement, but when it comes to the core to the production systems, we are seeing that still that part is missing. Or talking about the risk assessment, again, it is hovering around 55% to 32%. But all this data, I would say, with it's positive in a way that more and more information is there in public domain. We are finding similar trends when we are looking at non-financial disclosures that are taking place in India, where when we talk about companies' own operations, usually the assessment percentage will be around 70 to 80%. But the moment you move to supply chain, and when I talk about supply chain, we are still talking about tier 1 of the supply chain. It comes down to 16 to 26% in apparel sector when I talk about the data in India. And if we move further down to tier 2 and tier 3, I would say there's no information on those tiers at all. So this is the situation. The data is very much in resonance with realities on ground, what workers are talking about, certain changes, certain work pressures to increase productions. We do find resonance here in terms of the information. Thank you.
Thanks, Dheeraj. And I'm really keen to get into the local kind of Indian context as well as we go through the discussion. But first, I'll hand over to Liz for final remarks in terms of reflections on the data set.
Hi, I think that was for me,
Lisa.
Anya.
Sorry,
yeah,
Lisa.
no,
Yeah.
That's okay. Thank you so much. I just want to first to echo Dheeraj's comments to thank KnowTheChain for this tremendous work that you've done and continue to do, and really to offer my thanks as a representative of the investor sector to every panelist, because all the work that you're doing is so key to informing our discussions with companies around their supply chain due diligence. And I think, you know, I have two reflections. I was trying to have a positive one. So the positive one is that there has been, I think, a bit of a shift in terms of, you know, like when KnowTheChain was launched, companies thinking beyond their first tier suppliers. So there is, you know, progress and evidence that there's new efforts, like KnowTheChain has been very instrumental in helping us understand human rights due diligence and what companies are doing, right down even to the commodity level. And that's very useful for investors. I think on the flip side, when, you know, just pulling out one example from your very detailed research on commodities, like 98% of companies produce cotton garments, only 15% of them disclose even partial details on sourcing countries. So, you know, that's an example of a kind of immediate risk that investors should really be aware of and pressing the companies in their portfolios about, because there's legislation, as you and Rosie spoke to, in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, that has an immediate potential impact on the financial, you know, sustainability and returns that companies generate. So if companies are failing on something that really should be very top of mind, that is a red flag for investors in terms of our interaction with companies and our ability to, you know, understand, you know, really have confidence in what companies are doing in terms of overseeing their supply chain. The other thing I would say is this really should turn the lens back on investors. So we have a responsibility to press companies in our portfolios on these issues. We can't, you know, just like we believe that companies cannot put, you know, the responsibility onto their suppliers for, you know, these abuses, that they can hide behind, you know, their contract language or their codes of conduct. Similarly, investors who invest globally, as many of us do, and even if you don't, companies are global in terms of their supply chains. You know, we can't hide behind the idea that we didn't know, or you know, we trust that the companies are doing what they should. So I think, you know, KnowTheChain, the work that ICCR is doing through their equitable supply chain work is absolutely key. And another element that I wanted to bring up is just the collaboration, that investors coming together to understand these issues, to press companies. We've been involved in collaborative engagements with a couple of companies on the KnowTheChain list, carrying Inditex, as well as engaging directly Nike, as well as, you know, kind of doing our own, you know, our own one-on-one conversations with those companies. It's a key part of the work we're doing around equitable supply chains with our portfolio holdings. We see it as an enormously important area of work. And frankly, our clients are extremely concerned about this. So we want to partner with the companies that we invest with and also hold them accountable. So this type of research, this benchmark report, is incredibly useful for us being able to deliver on that promise to our clients.
Thanks so much, Lisa. That's really helpful and great feedback for us to know that the data is being used by the investment community as well. I wanted to kind of address the elephant in the room, as it were, in terms of, or one of the thorniest issues, I think, in what we have, what we've analysed, and that is this kind of top-down compliance-based approach to due diligence and the challenges that are associated with that, which, you know, Liz and Karen, you've already touched on in your opening remarks. And if we were to dig a little bit deeper into that, Liz, I'll start with you again, and then Karen, going on to talk about kind of the challenges of social auditing and this compliance-based approach, and whether and how social auditing plays a role in human rights due diligence. And so Liz, I'll hand over to you first, because I know you have just a few remarks on this, and then Karen, I'll hand over to you then afterwards to take the gauntlet.
Yeah, so I guess my main point is to clarify that auditing or inspections are not the problem per se. Auditing or inspections are actually part of binding agreements too, but those are explicitly independent, high quality inspections that are not done by commercial outfits that are hired individually by brands. And this is one fundamental difference between social auditing on the one hand and alternative approaches such as the International Accord. The act of auditing a facility itself is not the issue. It's the whole infrastructure of voluntary corporate self-regulation and the ultimate lack of accountability with that underpins social auditing. That is the problem. Unfortunately, the term auditing itself, I think, has become discredited after years of the failures of the social auditing industry, to the point where there is rightfully momentum from multiple quarters, not just trade unions, civil society organizations in the UN, but companies themselves, to ensure that emerging due diligence legislation would explicitly not allow voluntary auditing or company self-monitoring schemes to substitute for human rights due diligence. And I think that's actually a positive development, that there's a recognition that this model does not work. And we've been in conversations with investors as well, in which they say it's not fit for purpose. So this is a very widespread sentiment, and it's starting to make its way into the debate around emerging legislation and what should count as human rights due diligence. So maybe I'll just leave it at that for Transparentem to pick up the baton.
Thank you. Yeah, it is really concerning to us that fully 2/3 of all the work sites globally where Transparentem has uncovered labor abuses within the past decade, 2/3 of those work sites had been previously certified by an organization that purported to address those issues. And it just underscores the point, I think, that Liz was making. And I want to link back to that comment then, the lack of legitimate worker voice and worker empowerment in those workplaces, which can be an issue for all workers, and is a particular issue for migrant workers. This is fundamental. And I agree with the point that in the right context, audits can be helpful and useful, but it is probably no exaggeration to say that companies are probably wasting their resources on audits if they are assuming that those audits will consistently uncover forced labor where it exists, unless they have first worked to ensure that workers have legitimate representative bodies to represent their interests, and to support them when they have grievances. Without that, there is little reason to expect that audits would uncover serious crimes like forced labor. And without that, unfortunately, then the audits can be used to rubber stamp an existing power imbalance, despite what might be the good intentions of companies. And bringing it back to the Mauritius example that I spoke about earlier, buyers and suppliers in that instance pointed to the lack of specific information about significant recruitment costs, including from audits, as a justification for not repaying workers their estimated recruitment costs, despite the findings of Transparentem's investigation. That is, even though the context revealed, even through those audits, that workers were not consistently treated with dignity. This was apparent in that case from issues like the condition of dormitories, food, other more visible problems with living and working conditions. And crucially, workers also were not organized or represented in a meaningful way by an independent workers' organization. So in that kind of a context, there's little reasonable basis to rely on audits to reveal more hidden problems like recruitment fees and forced labor, which unfortunately are not always visible to the eye. So To have effective audits, it does fundamentally depend on workers feeling safe and secure in telling the truth. It's that simple, rather than, unfortunately, being subject potentially to intimidation and threats, which can result in bad audit results, wasted company resources, and unprotected workers.
Thanks so much, Karen. I think, yeah, from KnowTheChain side, we measure monitoring as a separate indicator to the risk assessment, and certainly treat it as just one element of the due diligence process. But even then, we find, you know, a great degree of different approaches and different methodologies to auditing, and very few companies publishing the results of those audit reports, which again is, you know, it casts doubt over the efficacy of the audits, and the methodology of the audits themselves. Great. Okay, I think I'll move to a slightly different topic and maybe more local context, because Dheeraj, you did touch on in your opening remarks what you're seeing from Indian companies in terms of disclosure and practice, and you've been essentially tracking public company disclosure for a number of years now, similar to what we've done. Is there anything that you're picking up there in terms of Indian companies? Or even the general political context more generally? Any insights from that would be much appreciated.
Yeah, so I think I can also link it to the last point that was made on auditing, that India has taken a different approach when it comes to how to ensure, if I can say, ESG compliance in companies' own operations and supply chains. And so here guidelines are voluntary in nature, but reporting is mandatory from the securities regulator side. So now what is happening, at least for top 1,000 listed companies in India, we have overarching guidelines are already in place that define any ESG, the holistic understanding, I would say, is there on ESG, which is on National Guidelines on Responsible Business Conduct. Based on those guidelines, there are reporting format which is called Business Responsibility and Sustainability Reporting Format, and on that 1,000 companies need to report. Now what has been done again to complement it further, for 150 companies it is going to become mandatory to do some kind of auditing for their own, for supply chain, 75% of their value chain upstream and downstream side. So, and this number is going to increase year by year. So that way, it's a very different approach where companies' own operation also need to strengthen. The framework itself is also providing a self-assessment kind of framework for companies where they can look at policy formulation to how those policies are being implemented and are further being evaluated. So this is happening for sure on a regulation side, and all of this is being linked to the investments, particularly with the ESG investments by the regulator here. So on a disclosure basis, we can clearly see a lot of movement happening. At least whenever new kind of guidelines come into picture, we do see that at least for 3-4 years, that kind of movement remains, where there is a very good disclosure that takes place, and then stagnation starts coming in. So it's always that as think tanks or as academic institutions, I think that entire ecosystem needs to be on your toes to keep engaging with the system and see that it gets updated on a regular basis. Further adding to that, now a lot of movement is towards building sectoral level supplements to this reporting framework. So already Indian Institute of Corporate Affairs has started one initiative where they are creating sectoral supplement on garment and textile sector. So that is one new development that is taking place. And among top 1,000, we have around 33 garment and textile sector companies that are disclosing on their non-financial indicators. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks so much, Dheeraj. But as we know, disclosure is one thing and practice is another. So let's see how that kind of filters down through to the workers on the ground. And I guess moving from one local context to another, and we have Karen and Lisa on the call from the US, and I wanted to just touch a little bit on the regulatory developments that were happening in that context in relation to kind of import bans, but also a kind of more broadly in terms of ESG. Certainly from a European perspective, you know, we're seeing this kind of backlash against ESG, and that's kind of become apparent in the proxy season in 2023. But Karen, I wonder if you could just reflect on the import ban and that effect on corporate transparency and behavior there, and then I'll pass over to Lisa to give her thoughts on the ESG side of things.
Great, thanks, Anya. Yes, so the US prohibition on the importation of goods produced with forced labor has effectively been in place since 2016, though it's really been on the books for many decades more than that. And a crucial element of that is the prohibition is on the importation of goods produced in whole or in part. So it should move beyond Tier 1. And I think it has had some positive effects, but it also is facing some serious challenges. It was one in a series of progressively stronger laws, I think, in the US that has meant that major companies are more and more aware of forced labor risks, the need for policies to address those risks throughout their supply chains, including beyond Tier 1. And so in that sense, it is one of several factors, and probably the most significant one of late, driving improvement to corporate policies, and strengthening some aspects of due diligence. Unfortunately, not fast enough, as I think your latest benchmark reveals. Adoption of the law also is having an impact on other countries. So as part of the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, Canada and Mexico also have agreed to impose the same import ban, though they're less far along in implementation. And worker rights advocates are now pushing for similar bans in other major markets. So I think those are positive developments, and this is helping drive improved norms. But unfortunately, the enforcement of the law is facing some challenges. One is that many of the same resources that the US government uses to enforce that law are also used to implement the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. That law has a lower standard in some sense, because it applies a rebuttable presumption that goods connected to Xinjiang are produced with forced labor. So in one way, that law is easier to enforce, and it has now been well over a year since the US government has engaged in an enforcement action on a product not from China. November 2022 was, so we're going back, back through 2023 to the year prior, to the last withhold release order, which is the enforcement action associated with that import prohibition on a product that's not from China. And because I think we've seen that companies are often reacting to external findings when they engage in remedy rather than those coming up through their own due diligence systems, is quite important to keep the pressure on companies through multiple and diverse enforcement actions implementing this import prohibition. And I think, another challenge is maybe more fundamental, that a focus on forced labor, as important as that is, necessarily entails a more reactive approach. By the time forced labor exists, it means that we have busted through other norms. It means that more than likely employers are already not meeting other core labor standards. So it would be important to see more proactive measures in place on a mandatory basis, whether that's through binding agreements, consistent enforcement of strong laws, or strong implementation of proactive due diligence systems on the part of companies. And really, ideally, a combination of all of that.
And Lisa?
Thanks. I just want to second what Karen said before I talk about the ESG backlash, that one of the problems with the UFLPA is it's backward looking. And we're really interested in asking the companies about their forward-looking approaches to remediation, which absolutely has to have worker-centered stakeholder processes in place. And it's something that as investors, as I say, we have a responsibility to make the case and ask those questions. In terms of the ESG backlash, a lot of smoke, but maybe not as much fire is my comment on that. There's certainly been, at the state level, there have been several laws passed and letters written by Republican attorneys general to essentially scare large investors, the State Street, Vanguard, Fidelities of the world, away from commitments they have made around ESG investing, around tackling climate change, et cetera. And I suppose attention to supply chain accountability and human rights due diligence can be a not intentional, but an additional victim of this wave, this backlash. But what the actual impact of the rhetoric of the laws and letters that have been written is, I think, fairly minimal, certainly in terms of the assets that have been gathered by strategies that are devoted to or that use ESG information. What it has been useful, or what it has unfortunately done is led to a term. I just saw a friend last night who talked about this green hushing, where companies are scared, I think, of becoming a target, and so therefore don't talk about their initiatives as much. And I can see how this could have a negative impact on some of the work that KnowTheChain is supporting and the other speakers on this call, if companies shy away from the transparency and traceability initiatives that we as investors and part of ensuring better standards and eliminating the worst abuses that occur in global supply chains. So I think we really need to keep an eye on that. I'm hoping, we have an election coming up here in the United States. So, fingers crossed that, well, I don't think this wave is going to disappear no matter what the result of the election is, but I hope that there's less energy, I suppose, behind it after the election, but we'll see.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And that's a really interesting point you mentioned around green hushing, I think. Do you see that as a kind of a reaction to, increased legislation? Companies now, like quite a lot of the sustainability information and supply chain information has to be passed through legal teams, compliance, programs, and therefore what gets ultimately put out can't be information about a pilot or a sample of a sample or something that a company is less accurate about, perhaps. And therefore they're pulling back.
So Karen might be able to speak. I'm not a lawyer, but what I will say is that the United States has a more litigious legal culture than other parts of the world, and that makes legal counsels, corporate counsels, probably they're more likely to say no to things that we are asking about. And I also think that the goal of these campaigns or these initiatives is exactly to it's not out, the legal risks I don't think are very high, but it's a political risk. You don't want to be in the bullseye of one of these investigations. And I will just mention just very quickly that a friend of mine who's head of responsible investing for a European investor called me in a panic after his firm received a letter from one of these attorneys general. His corporate counsel was absolutely freaking out. So this was a very broad letter about their involvement in one of the it was around the environmental it was around the E of ESG. And they were scared. They were scared. And so the letter had its intended effect, even if, the actual risk, they're being accused essentially of being involved in a, what's it called? Not a cabal, but
like an anti-competitive.
Thank you, cartel.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And so they were basically at a loss when they received this letter, and they're calling around to other peers to say, like, how are you responding to this? So I think there's definitely, it's been effective in that sense, and nobody wants that, we also have received a letter from Jim Jordan, the chair of the Judiciary Committee. We haven't been subpoenaed, but we've been asked to produce materials. So, we're happy to share materials. We're not hiding anything about the work that we do. But I think for other investors, it's a bit, my boss says this is an indication of how successful we're being, so.
Well, this is it. I think Phil Bloomer from the Research Centre would say the exact same thing. But that's really interesting, and I think it kind of brings to bear some of the concerns, rightly or wrongly, that are around kind of the collaborative engagements, right? And ensuring that investors being slightly concerned to break any rules that might imply that they're acting in consort, right? Or like trying to price set, which we have not seen in any collaborative engagement it go that far, never with that intention, which is why some of these collaborative engagements are not as effective as they could be. But yeah, that's certainly feedback that we get from some investors around joining collaborative engagements. Great, just conscious of time, moving on to the next question, and this is for Liz. Liz, maybe if I pose this question to you, being devil's advocate here for the benchmarking model, right? Hopefully, in a number of years, human rights due diligence becomes the norm, it becomes mandatory, and in that world, what do you see as the role of kind of voluntary reporting and benchmarks in particular in delivering the kind of change that we want to see on the ground? And I'll go to Liz first, but then if anybody has any thoughts just before we go to the Q&A.
So do benchmarks have a place with emerging hard laws? I mean,
laws can and should ideally lead to comparable, meaningful company reporting on human rights and environmental impact, but obviously we're not there yet. I think benchmarks still have a place. They are useful for comparing companies and providing large data sets and publicly calling out companies that perform poorly. There are limitations. You're working often with lagging indicators. And as we've talked about throughout the session, it's still based primarily on a company's own reporting, which itself is heavily skewed towards policies and procedures and not implementation. And that's a problem we've seen for 20 years, and we really need to move past it. I think most useful would be better cross-checking of company reporting with what others are saying and doing. And so for IndustriALL, key indicators are a company's commitment to freedom of association, actually working with trade unions in the supply chain, participating in global framework agreements and binding agreements that we've talked about. So maybe I'll just leave it at that.
And Dheeraj, I might actually just pose the question to you in terms of the work that you're doing, because it is in a similar vein to KnowTheChain. Do you see any challenges in terms of that work in collecting public disclosure from companies or analyzing public disclosure? And how do you seek to kind of verify what companies are reporting with what the situation is for workers on the ground?
Yeah, I think surely there will be some of the challenges might already be kind of emerging also. Like what is happening a lot of the time, brands are talking to brands, and that's where the entire conversation is. And so even when we are doing any kind of benchmarking or disclosures, they are about either for tier one or for brands in, let's say, even brands in global south. So it is, this conversation needs to move further down the supply chain. Surely workers need to be at the center or even other stakeholders like MSMEs need to come to the center if we want to make some of these benchmarks relevant, because those are the spaces from where counter narratives start. coming out, and that's where the lot of I will say challenges in the supply chain or ESG compliance or responsible conduct, business conduct, whatever we can give it different names, but that's where the real challenges are. And so if I would say a lot of strengthening around ecosystem is required when it comes to workers, communities, and MSMEs, and how different kind of user groups can start using this data. So that's where the authenticity of the data will start coming in. Otherwise, we may fall into a situation where uh, good scores may not always mean that things are good on ground. So we might be hiding a lot. Yeah. So these are the challenges that I have seen happening in the work that we were also doing earlier and are doing right now. So just to highlight some of those. Yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I think KnowTheChain can relate really well to that in terms of, picking up company self-reporting. We do have mechanisms in place. I think, Rosie, you've answered a question in the chat about whether we rely solely on self-reported information. We do try to verify to a large extent, and we're very lucky to have colleagues within the resource center and within the movement to be able to verify some of the data that brands are disclosing, for us to be able to accurately evaluate their practice, and in addition, taking reputable third-party sources as sources of allegations to kind of sit alongside the self-reporting of companies. But of course, there is always an element of self-reporting bias, I think, when you're looking at brands' publicly available information. And of course, yes, another challenge, taking this information to the stakeholder groups on the ground for them to be able to use it effectively, is another key challenge of ours. Okay, so what I'll do now is I'll jump to the Q&A, because I know we've got a couple of questions in the chat box and the Q&A box. So the first one is around delays in the CS-DDD, and I'll just put this out to anybody who wants to respond. Is there a concern that the recent pushback will water down the proposed regulation? Does anybody have a burning passion to answer that question?
I could address
absolutely.
a comment to that, and I'm certainly not an expert on European legislation, but I think I'm guessing that the question is in some sense rhetorical, because I mean, yes, of course, and it's really concerning. And I think, the comment I wanted to make is broader about government regulation. In addition to what we spoke about in the U.S. context, related to the import ban, there's also a very concerning movement in the United States to actually weaken child labor laws after a century of those laws being in place. And so whether we're talking about CS-DDD or some of the US and other domestic laws in other countries, I would really like to draw together what should be required as part of corporate due diligence with the need for stronger government regulation and stronger enforcement. Because we haven't talked a lot so far about the role of government today, despite some companies' discomfort level with it, we actually advocate in some cases that part of due diligence is becoming a voice in pushing governments in the countries where you are doing business to enact and enforce fair wages, enforce worker protections that may be on the books, but are disregarded in fact, impose accountability on the foreign worker recruitment sector, and protect workers and workers' rights to freedom of association. And unfortunately, we sometimes see some block of companies, not all, pushing in a different direction, which is against stronger regulation, and therefore less rule of law. And so, I would just say, in the context of Europe and CS-DDD, we need due diligence to include much more proactive efforts to have stronger laws on the books, so that companies who often, unfortunately, use the excuse, well, this shouldn't be our job, it should be the government's job to enforce these laws, but then they need to become a very strong voice for that, not only in Europe, but in countries, sourcing countries where they probably would be viewed as a much stronger constituent to those governments because they're supporting the economy of those countries as compared to, little NGOs like Transparentem, who those governments might not want to listen to as much. So I just make that point broadly about companies' due diligence and work on government policy issues.
Thank you, Karen. And I would also just add there in terms of like both the practice, but also the transparency piece. I think one of the benefits of the KnowTheChain benchmark is that we make company good practice very transparent so that companies can understand what that looks like and then take steps to work towards that. And a key element of these due diligence legislations is to create that interoperability through transparency. And without those mandatory requirements around both practice and disclosure, it's very hard to see how the sector can improve because nobody knows what anybody else is doing and how to work towards better practice. So there's that element of transparency around that. But yes, agree that the delay with the regulation poses a real threat to the agreed text and the kind of very the elements that are in there that are already quite not strong enough by some measures, but equally you have the stakeholder engagement piece and you have the reference to purchasing practices, yes, the threat to those elements is quite real. Excellent. Okay, just moving on to the next question, and Rosie, I wonder if you might be able to kind of answer this one for us. Is there a key difference found in apparel and footwear industry in comparison to other industries?
Yes, yeah, it's a good question, and I think there are some distinctions. So on one side, I think we see a bit more union engagement in the sector, which is not necessarily an indication of how well apparel companies are doing at it, but more so how poorly food and beverage and companies are doing with union engagement. I think the other sort of area, which is perhaps surprising, is that companies are slightly more used to disclosing information on their purchasing practices and disclosing data such as payment terms in this sector than they are in the other sectors. And again, there's a significant way to go. So it's not to say that it's well ahead, but I think that it's a good sign that it's possible to push further in transparency in this area. And there's also, initiatives operating in this sector that can help to drive that as well. On the flip side, I think we see much poorer performance in this sector, certainly than the ICT sector, on the theme of recruitment. So fewer policies in place and certainly less remediation. There's a lot more data and examples of remedy of recruitment fees for supply chain workers in the ICT sector that came through a lot more strongly than it did in this sector. So I think, yeah, some areas where we're seeing apparel sort of pushing ahead, but equally some areas not being prioritized that should be.
Thanks, Rosie. The second question there is a key takeaway in seeing indicators themes that show improvement or increase and the one that has been stagnant. I think I'll take a first stab at this just in terms of that really important piece around supplier lists and transparency. I mean, this is a sector that has been under increased scrutiny for the last, number of years in terms of the public disclosure of supplier lists. And I think, as a result of those very public campaigns, investor engagement, and engagement from the wider movement, we are seeing, it pay off in terms of transparency and supplier lists, which is a much greater degree of transparency than we see from other sectors, particularly in tier one. And I do think that is as a result of public pressure around this, and it reaching kind of a critical mass of companies that are doing it now to say, in order for us to push back and to companies' responses that this is anti-competitive, that this is, not possible for them to do. There are a number of excellent examples from across the apparel and footwear company list that we can demonstrate that this is very achievable for a large number of companies in the sector. And just in the interest of time, I'll move quickly on to 3, still related to number 2. Is one indicator harder than others, or they're actually pretty equal in terms of difficulties in implementation? That's a good question. I mean, again, just taking a stab, and then I'll hand over to Rosie if you wanted to come in with anything else. I think any of the indicators that we have that are focused on kind of outputs or outcomes are always going to be more difficult to for companies to disclose, just because there's no requirement on them to disclose that as yet. And so it's only the leading companies that are demonstrating how effective, a policy is in achieving its goals, or how something is being implemented and working in practice. So that goes across our entire suite of indicators, from providing remedy examples to workers where human rights have been violated, to demonstrating how recruitment policies are being implemented and how companies are preventing fees being charged in the first place. But I'll hand quickly over to Rosie in case you wanted to add something else.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you said, Anya, about there's some things that companies are not necessarily collecting already at this point, data that companies not necessarily collecting already. So that is what might be considered harder. I think it's more so where we see improvements and where we don't. It's more so a sign of what is being prioritized by companies. So I think that's why we've seen that increase in supply chain transparency in terms of supplier lists. We're not seeing it so much in the areas of purchasing practices and remedies. So perhaps those are not been priorities by companies, although they should be. So hopefully, as regulation evolves, that we can see a bit more movement in these really key areas that do require some quite fundamental changes for business models, firstly in terms of purchasing practices, and also are most important for workers in terms of remedy.
Thanks, Rosie. So we have just 2 more questions in the chat. So we'll just address those quite quickly. Do we have any information on how the companies use new technologies such as blockchain or artificial intelligence to strengthen the transparency of their supply chains? We do pick this up, and I would encourage everybody, just by the way, to look at the full data set that we publish on the 65 companies. It's available to download via the website, and we'll link that to you in a follow-up email with the link to the recording. But you can see for indicators 3.1 to 3.3, we'll collect information on how companies are tracing their supply chains. We haven't seen this come up, or maybe 1 or 2 companies within the apparel sector, Rosie, if I'm not mistaken, but we haven't seen it come up so prominently, as it were, as I guess some companies would have us believe. And so I think this is still a very, very nascent technology, but there are, of course, multiple other platforms and tracing organizations out there, like the likes of TrustTrace and Oratain, that we do see companies using quite frequently. Okay, Thanks so much, Rosie. Okay, last question before we run out of time. How can a brand effectively communicate the importance of due diligence tools to workers, ensuring they grasp their significance and utilize them effectively? Can a brand communicate the importance of due diligence tools to the workers? Yes, Liz, I see you on mute.
Well, through their actions, I mean, through upholding workers' rights in the first place, you know, by participating in good faith in freedom of association and in collective bargaining, that builds in worker voice automatically. And it's not so much a tool of due diligence, but it is a fundamental it is a fundamental right that has to be upheld in order for due diligence to be carried out properly.
Great, thanks so much, Liz. And with that, we are out of time. I just want to thank all of our panelists again for that fantastic discussion, the insights that you provided, the expertise, and of course, all of your work in the area, which is so vital to the business and human rights movement and the labour movement. So thank you once again for joining the discussion. Thank you all as well for attending and for giving us your ear for an hour and a half. Thank you so much to the KnowTheChain team as well, Rosie Monaghan and Veronica, who's not here with us today. But we remain at your disposal to answer any questions. Please just send me an email, and you can expect a link with the recording to the webinar in your inboxes quite soon. So thank you so much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.